My name is Demetrios of Rhodes, and I sit in darkness now, chains cold against my wrists, while the smell of burned papyrus still clings to my hair. 3 months I have been prisoner in this stone cell beneath what was once the palace of the Ptolemies, and in 3 months I have not stopped seeing the flames. They dance before my eyes when I sleep, when I wake, when I stare at these walls that weep with Mediterranean damp. I was a scholar once, a keeper of wisdom, a guardian of scrolls that held the thoughts of Aristotle and Euripides, Herodotus and Thucydides, mathematicians whose names you would know, and poets whose verses could make stone weep. Now I am nothing but a failed custodian, a man who watched the greatest repository of human knowledge burn and did nothing to stop it. But I get ahead of myself. You want to know how it happened, how fire came to Alexandria, how Rome brought war to the city of learning. Very well, I will tell you, though the telling brings me no peace. Perhaps confession is all I have left. Perhaps some scribe will find these words scratched into stone and know that at least one man mourned what was lost that day. When Caesar's ambition met Ptolemaic pride and the world grew darker for it. I came to Alexandria in my 30th year, drawn like so many Greeks to the Mouseion, that great institution of learning founded by the first Ptolemy, when Alexander's empire shattered into warring kingdoms. Rhodes had been my home, that island of sun and commerce where I learned rhetoric and philosophy, where I first touched a scroll and felt the thrill of connection across centuries to minds long dead. But Rhodes was small, provincial, and Alexandria was the world. 400,000 souls crowded into that city, where the Nile Delta met the sea, Greeks and Egyptians, Jews and Phoenicians, a babel of tongues unified by commerce and the peculiar hybrid culture the Ptolemies had cultivated. The royal quarter, the Mouseion, sprawled along the eastern harbor, all marble colonnades and bronze statues gleaming in sunlight, palaces rising tier upon tier like a mountain of human aspiration. And at its heart, the Mouseion and its libraries, repositories of perhaps 500,000 scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of the civilized world. I walked those peripatos colonnades in the mornings, sandals whispering on polished stone, discussing Plato's forms with fellow scholars, while slaves trimmed the gardens and peacocks screamed from ornamental trees. We dined communally in the great exedra, reclining on couches while Egyptian servants brought honeyed figs and Nile fish, wine from Chios mixing with scholarly debate about the measurement of the earth or the interpretation of Homer's gods. The smell of papyrus was everywhere, that dry grass scent mixed with ink and cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls. We were arrogant, I suppose, in our certainty that we were engaged in humanity's highest calling. We catalogued and copied, translated Egyptian hieroglyphs into Greek, debated whether Zenodotus had been right in his editorial choices for the Iliad, compiled astronomical tables and medical treatises. The smell of papyrus was everywhere, that dry grass scent mixed with ink and cedar oil used to preserve the scrolls. The outside world seemed distant, unimportant. We knew of Rome's civil war, of course. Word had reached us that Pompey and Caesar had finally come to blows at Pharsalus, that the Republic was tearing itself apart, as the Ptolemaic kingdom had done so often. But it seemed far away, a problem for Italians and legionaries, nothing to do with us in our marble sanctuary. We were catastrophically, tragically wrong. The first sign came in late September, by Roman reckoning, when ships appeared on the horizon, war galleys with bronze rams cutting through the azure Mediterranean. Word spread through the city like fire through dry grass. Pompey the Great had arrived, fleeing Caesar's victory, seeking refuge with young Ptolemy, whose father he had once restored to power. The court was in chaos. Ptolemy XIII was barely 15, a boy king dominated by his advisors, chief among them the eunuch Pothinus and the rhetorician Theodotus. His sister Cleopatra, rightful co-ruler, had been driven into exile by these same courtiers, raising an army in the eastern desert. Civil war was brewing even before Rome arrived. I remember standing on the palace terrace that day, shielding my eyes against the sun, watching Pompey's small fleet drop anchor. We could see figures on the deck, the famous general himself perhaps, unaware that Pothinus and Theodotus were already plotting his murder. They feared Rome's wrath, feared that harboring Caesar's enemy would bring legions crashing down on Egypt. Better to kill Pompey, they reasoned, and present his head to Caesar as a gift. 3 days later, it was done. Pompey rowed ashore in a small boat, met by Achillas the general and a detachment of soldiers. They stabbed him on the beach like a pig for slaughter, severed his head, pickled it in brine. I did not witness it myself, but heard the accounts from palace servants, their voices hushed with horror at the impiety of murdering a Roman consul, a man who had walked as conqueror through Jerusalem, butchered on Egyptian sand by order of a boy king. The smell of incense from the palace temples could not mask the stench of political murder. 4 days after that, Caesar arrived. I was in the library's great hall when the commotion began, carefully unrolling a scroll of Aeschylus, while autumn lights slanted through high windows. The sound of marching feet, thousands of them, rhythmic and iron-shod, echoed through the Mouseion. I set down the scroll and hurried to the colonnade, joining other scholars who pressed against the marble balustrades. Below, filing through the palace gates with standards raised high, came the legionaries. 4,000 of them, red cloaks bright against bronze armor, shields locked in formation, gladii bouncing at their hips. They moved with a precision that was almost beautiful, terrifying in its absolute discipline. At their head rode a man in his 50s, lean and balding, dressed in a purple-trimmed toga despite the warrior's entrance. Caesar. Even from a distance you could sense the force of him, the certainty in his posture of a man who had conquered Gaul and crushed Pompey and now arrived in Alexandria as though it were his by right. He dismounted in the great courtyard where pharaohs had received tribute for 300 years, looking around with the casual interest of a tourist. Then Pothinus came forward, slaves in tow carrying a gilded chest. The eunuch's voice carried in the sudden silence, oily and obsequious, offering the hospitality of Egypt, expressing joy at the arrival of Rome's champion. He gestured, and the chest was opened. I could not see from my distance, but word rippled through the watching crowd, Pompey's head and signet ring. I expected Caesar to be pleased. Instead, his face darkened with what I later learned to recognize as one of his calculated rages. He turned away from the grisly trophy, his voice sharp enough to carry to the colonnades. Pompey had been his son-in-law once, married to Julia. They had been enemies at the end, but Romans, not carrion for Egyptian knives. The insult was clear. These boy kings and their eunuch handlers had presumed to solve Rome's civil war with murder. Pothinus stepped back, confusion on his soft features. The soldiers behind Caesar shifted, hands moving to gladii hilts. The Egyptian guards around the courtyard raised spears. For a moment I thought we would see blood spilled there and then, but Caesar was too clever for open battle yet. He waved his soldiers down, accepted Pothinus's stammered assurances, and withdrew to the royal apartments. The Alexandrians exhaled collectively, but the tension did not dissipate. It thickened, grew heavier, pressed down on the city like the weight of summer storms. That night in the scholars' quarters, we debated what it meant. Some argued Caesar would leave soon, his war was elsewhere. Others, wiser or more cynical, predicted he would stay, would meddle, would impose Rome's will on a kingdom too weak to resist. I remember Theon, an old mathematician from Naucratis, shaking his grizzled head over his wine, muttering that Romans were barbarians with good roads, that they respected nothing but force. I defended Rome, or tried to, arguing that Caesar himself wrote histories, that surely a man of letters would respect our institutions. Theon laughed, a bitter sound. Wait and see what respect barbarians show when their interests are threatened. He was right, of course. He was right, and I was a fool. The days that followed brought a slow unraveling. Caesar announced he would settle the dispute between Ptolemy and Cleopatra, acting as arbiter by authority of the Senate, as though Egypt were some client state. Pothinus seethed, but smiled, sending messages to General Achillas, who commanded the royal army outside the city. Cleopatra, bold and cunning, smuggled herself back into Alexandria rolled in a carpet, presented herself to Caesar. I did not see that famous meeting, but heard of it from a chamberlain who claimed she emerged hours later, the alliance between Rome and Egypt's rightful queen sealed in the most ancient way. Ptolemy raged when he learned of it, throwing his diadem to the floor, weeping with fury that his sister had betrayed him. The city began to fracture. Alexandrians resented Roman occupation, the swaggering legionaries who treated our streets like conquered territory. Riots broke out in the markets, gangs of Greeks and Egyptians clashing with soldiers. I smelled smoke on the wind more than once, saw looters running with stolen amphorae. Then in late October, Achilles arrived with the royal army. 20,000 men, Macedonian-trained phalangists, Egyptian marines, Gabiniani mercenaries who had gone native. They surrounded the Mouseion, cutting Caesar off from the rest of Alexandria. Caesar's 4,000 legionaries suddenly seemed very few. The scholars of the Mouseion met in emergency session, debating whether to flee to the Serapeum's daughter library or stay. In the end, most stayed, unwilling to abandon the scrolls we had spent lifetimes curating. I stayed because the library was my home and my heart, because I believed that no one would harm a place of learning. The siege began in earnest in early November. I woke one morning to the sound of trumpets and war cries. From the upper windows, I watched Achilles' forces assault the palace gates, saw rams swinging against cedar wood, saw arrows darting like vicious birds. Caesar's legionaries repulsed them, pilum javelins hurled in volleys that dropped men screaming, but it was clear he could not break out. The Romans fortified the palace and the adjoining theatre, turning the cultural heart of Alexandria into a military citadel. They tore up paving stones for barricades, ripped tapestries for bandages, commandeered our grain stores. We scholars found ourselves trapped inside the perimeter, non-combatants in a war we did not understand. I remember the sounds most clearly, the constant background noise of siege, shouting and hammer blows, screams carried to the palace infirmary where Egyptian physicians worked beside Roman medics. The smell changed too, the pleasant incense and papyrus scent giving way to sweat, blood, and the acrid smoke of burning pitch. At night, I lay on my pallet, listening to distant fighting, wondering how long it could last. Not long, I thought. Caesar would negotiate or reinforcements would arrive. It could not last. But I was wrong. Days became weeks. Weeks became a month. Food grew scarce. Water came from palace cisterns that would last months, but left us dependent on supplies. The library's oil lamps burned low as we rationed fuel. Scrolls that had been read by lamplight for 300 years sat in darkness now, wisdom buried in shadow. Then came the day everything changed, the day I replay endlessly in this cell. It was December. I was cataloguing scrolls in a subsidiary archive near the harbour when I heard shouting from the royal docks. Not the usual battle noise, but something more urgent. I hurried to the nearest window looking out over the harbour. What I saw made my heart stop. The Egyptian fleet, Ptolemy's warships blockading Caesar, was burning. Ships by the dozen, flames leaping from deck to deck, thick black smoke roiling into the sky. At first I thought a lamp had overturned, but then I saw the pattern. Roman small boats darting among the galleys, legionaries hurling amphoras of flaming oil. Caesar was burning the fleet to prevent it being used against him. The tactical sense was clear, brutal, and effective. Deny your enemy their ships, remove the naval threat. But fire does not respect tactics. Fire spreads. I watched in growing horror as flames jumped from the burning ships to the docks, to the warehouses lining the harbour where merchants stored grain and linen, and yes, scrolls. Thousands upon thousands of scrolls waiting to be shipped to Rome or Athens or copied for the library. The wind was from the north, blowing flames inland, and the warehouses were old wood, tinder dry. They caught like kindling. I ran. I do not remember the decision, only the sudden frantic need to reach those warehouses, to save what could be saved. I pelted through the palace corridors, past startled soldiers, into the courtyard where the smell of smoke was already choking. Other scholars had seen the fire too, emerging from the library with the same desperate purpose. But Roman guards blocked the gates. "No one leaves," Their centurion barked in accented Greek. "Caesar's orders. Too dangerous." I argued, pleaded, explained that priceless scrolls were burning, that we had to act now. He looked at me with the blank incomprehension of a man to whom scrolls meant nothing but dried reeds with scratches, and shook his head. "No one leaves." Behind him, the smoke rose in a great black column, blotting out the sun. I could hear the roar of the flames now, a hungry crackling punctuated by the crash of collapsing timbers. Somewhere in that inferno, the collected works of Sophocles' lesser plays were curling to ash. Medical treatises compiled by Egyptian priests over millennia were blackening. Star charts and mathematical proofs were dying, and I stood behind a Roman spear line, powerless. Some younger scholars tried to force their way past. The soldiers shoved them back. One boy took a gladius pommel to the face and went down spitting blood. The rest of us fell back, defeated by iron discipline and our own physical weakness. We were men of words, not warriors. We had no weapons but rhetoric, and rhetoric cannot argue with steel. I returned to the library in a daze, climbed to the highest terrace, and watched Alexandria burn. The fire spread beyond the warehouses to the nearby tenements, those cramped multi-story insula where the poor lived. People poured into the streets, carrying children and meager possessions, screaming as flames chased them. Achilles' army could not fight the blaze, too busy maintaining the siege, and the fire brigades were overwhelmed. For 3 days, the harbor district burned. 3 days of smoke so thick, it turned noon to twilight, of ash falling like black snow on the palace gardens. The library itself was safe, too far from the harbor and built of stone, but I felt no relief. I sat in the great hall, surrounded by scrolls, and thought only of the thousands more that had just been lost. Theon found me there on the 3rd day, staring at nothing. Aeschylus unrolled before me. He said nothing, just sat beside me in companionable grief. We were both weeping, old men crying over burned papyrus, while outside the city tore itself apart. That is when the guards came for me. They were Caesar's soldiers, 3 of them, in dust-stained armor still smelling of smoke and sweat, led by a junior tribune who looked barely older than the scholar they had beaten. "You are Demetrios of Rhodes?" the tribune asked, consulting a wax tablet. I stood, Theon gripping my arm in support. "I am. What is this about?" "You are arrested on suspicion of espionage and sabotage. Come with us." The words made no sense, each one comprehensible, yet together meaningless. Espionage? Sabotage? I was a scholar, a librarian. I had no interest in politics or war beyond hoping they would go away. I said as much, my voice rising with incredulity and fear. The tribune was unmoved. "Several witnesses saw you attempting to leave the palace during the fire, trying to access the harbor district. Others report you correspond with persons in General Achilles' camp. You will explain yourself to the interrogators." "I was trying to save the scrolls," I shouted, and heard my voice crack. "The scrolls in the warehouses were burning. I only wanted—" "Save your explanations," the tribune interrupted. "You will have opportunity to provide them under formal questioning." The guards seized my arms, not roughly, but with the inexorable firmness of men following orders. Theon protested. Other scholars clustered around, demanding to know the charges, invoking our status as protected servants of the Muses. It meant nothing. Roman military law cares little for academic privilege. They hauled me through the palace to the lower levels, to the warren of storerooms and cisterns beneath the royal apartments where prisoners could be held. My cell was small, perhaps 8 feet square, carved from living rock with a heavy door of cedar wood banded in iron. A pallet of mouldy straw in one corner, a bucket for waste in another, and nothing else. They shoved me inside, slammed the door, shot the bolts home. Darkness, complete and absolute, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyeballs, that makes you doubt whether you still exist. I stood frozen, disoriented, breathing too fast, panic rising like floodwater. I forced myself to calm, to think. This was a mistake, clearly. I would be questioned, I would explain. Someone with authority would recognize the absurdity of charging a scholar with sabotage. I would be released, probably with apologies. I was wrong about that too. I lost track of time in the darkness. They brought food once a day, a guard opening a slot in the door to shove through a bowl of thin barley gruel and a cup of sour water, then slamming the slot shut before I could speak. I called out questions, explanations, pleas. Silence answered. I slept when exhaustion overcame fear, woke to the same black void, could not tell if hours or days had passed. My mind began to fray at the edges, thoughts circling endlessly around the fire, the burning scrolls, my failure to save them. I had not realized how much of my identity was bound up in my role, in being Demetrios the scholar. Stripped of that, locked in darkness with nothing to read or write, I was no one, formless, a voice crying in emptiness. Then the interrogation began. They came for me in what I guessed was the middle of the night. 2 guards dragged me up narrow stairs, my legs weak from disuse, and threw me into a small room lit by sputtering oil lamps. The light hurt after so much darkness, made me squint and weep. When my eyes adjusted, I saw a table, a chair occupied by a Roman officer I did not recognize, a scribe in the corner, ready to record my words. "Sit," the officer said in Greek. I sat, swaying with exhaustion. "You are Demetrios of Rhodes, scholar of the Mouseion." It was not a question, but I nodded. "You are charged with conspiracy to aid the forces of the usurper Ptolemy against the legitimate authority of Gaius Julius Caesar." "That is insane," I said, my voice hoarse. "I am a scholar. I have no interest in your war. I only tried to save scrolls from the fire, scrolls that were burning because Caesar burned the fleet." The officer's expression did not change. "You maintain correspondence with individuals in the enemy camp. You were observed attempting to breach our perimeter during a military operation. You have expressed hostility toward Rome in conversations." Each accusation was based on some grain of truth twisted beyond recognition. Yes, I had friends among Achilles' soldiers, fellow Greeks who served in the Ptolemaic phalangists, and yes, we had exchanged letters before the siege discussing philosophy, not military secrets. Yes, I had tried to reach the burning warehouses. Yes, I had criticized Roman arrogance. But to call it conspiracy. "Who accuses me?" I demanded. "Show me my accusers." "That is not our custom," the officer said. "You will answer our questions. If your answers satisfy, you will be released. If not..." He let the sentence hang. For hours they questioned me. Who did I know in Achilles' camp? What intelligence had I passed? Was the library loyal to the boy king or to Rome? The questions circled and looped back, trying to catch me in contradictions. I answered truthfully because truth was all I had, explaining over and over that I was not a spy, just a man who had dedicated his life to preserving knowledge that these brutal wars were destroying. The scribe scratched away with his stylus, recording words that would be weighed against me. Finally, as dawn light began to creep through a high window, the officer waved a hand. "Return him to his cell." The guards hauled me back down to darkness and stone. The interrogations became routine. Every few days, another session of questions and accusations, and my increasingly desperate denials. Between sessions, I languished in the cell, fed barely enough to keep me alive, given no writing materials despite my begging. The absence of something to read was its own torture, worse than the physical discomfort. My mind, trained for decades to engage with texts, had nothing to work with, turned inward on itself. I recited poetry from memory to keep sane, Greek hexameters and elegiac couplets, anything to maintain some structure of thought. Slowly, I realized that release was not coming, that the charges were not going to be dropped. I was as much a prisoner of the siege as Caesar himself. Outside my cell, the war continued. I could hear it sometimes through the stone, muffled sounds of fighting, trumpet calls, the distant thud of siege engines. The guards who brought my food spoke occasionally, brief comments that gave me glimpses of the wider conflict. Caesar had seized the lighthouse island of Pharos, they said, controlling the harbor entrance, but lost it again in a failed assault on the connecting bridge. He had nearly drowned, swimming to safety when his small boat was sunk, holding his battle dispatches above water with one hand while enemies shot arrows at his bobbing head. The image would have been comical if it were not so desperate. Pothinus was dead, executed as a traitor when messages he had sent to Achilles were intercepted. Arsinoe, the younger sister, had fled the palace to join the besiegers, proclaimed herself queen, ignited fresh factional fighting within the royal army. The siege was fracturing both sides, Caesar trapped in the Mouseion, while his enemies quarreled over who should lead them. And I sat in darkness, irrelevant to these great events, yet caught in their machinery, ground between millstones of ambition and pride. Weeks passed, my body weakened, muscles atrophying, my scholar's soft hands growing calloused from stone walls I traced in boredom. My mind remained sharp though, perhaps too sharp, honing itself on guilt. I thought constantly of the fire, of the scrolls I had not saved, of the knowledge lost forever because I had been too weak, too obedient to Roman authority, too willing to retreat behind spear points. What was scholarship worth if scholars would not die to preserve it? What good was my vaunted learning if I could be cowed by a centurion's growl? I had thought myself civilized, superior to these crude warriors with their iron and violence, but when it mattered, I had proven equally helpless. The barbarism was not in Rome alone, but in the whole edifice of power that made armed men the arbiters of culture's fate. In my darker moments, I wondered if we deserved to lose the library, if a civilization that could not protect its own accumulated wisdom deserved to keep it. Then I would remember a particular scroll, some favorite text, imagine its destruction, and the grief would overwhelm me again. Contradictory thoughts, irreconcilable emotions, the mind eating itself in the darkness. One day, perhaps 2 months into my captivity, a new sound filtered down to my cell. Cheering, faint but unmistakable, the roar of soldiers celebrating. The guard who brought my gruel that night was expansive, almost friendly. "Great news," he said. "Reinforcements have arrived from Rhodes. 3 dozen ships broke through the blockade, brought supplies and fresh troops. Caesar can hold out indefinitely now." Rhodes, my home. Ships from my island coming to rescue Caesar, to prolong this war, to keep me trapped in this hole while Alexandria tore itself apart. I should have felt something, pride or sorrow or anger, but I felt nothing, just a vast grey emptiness. Let them reinforce, let them fight, let them burn the whole city to ash. What did it matter? The knowledge was already gone. Then came the second fire. I did not see this one, only heard the reports from guards and later from a fellow prisoner, a palace servant who had been thrown into the next cell. We spoke through the stone wall, our voices distorted but comprehensible. Caesar, emboldened by the reinforcements, had released Ptolemy from his protective custody, hoping the boy king would make peace with his sister. Instead, Ptolemy had rejoined the forces now commanded by Arsinoe's general Ganymede after Achilles' murder. The fighting intensified. The Alexandrians tried a new tactic, flooding Caesar's freshwater cisterns with seawater. Caesar launched a naval assault on the harbor district to secure new water sources. More fires broke out. This time buildings closer to the Mouseion court, tenements and warehouses and shops. Did it reach the library? I croaked through the wall, my heart hammering. Did the fire reach the Mouseion? A pause. I don't know. I don't think so. The palace was safe, and the library is built of stone. It should have survived. But the smoke was terrible, everything covered in ash. I could not see clearly. Should have survived. Should have. The uncertainty was its own agony. In my mind, the flames consumed everything, every scroll, every catalogue. I saw the great hall's cedar shelves catching fire, saw papyrus curling and blackening, saw the works of Sappho and Pindar crumbling to dust. I saw Euclid's geometry proofs dissolving, saw Eratosthenes' measurement of the earth reduced to ash. 300 years of Ptolemaic patronage and scholarly dedication erased in an afternoon of flames and politics. Whether it was true or not, almost did not matter. The fire had burned in my imagination so many times that it had become real. Guilt is like that. It does not require actual culpability, only the belief in it. I failed the library by not dying to save it, by not forcing my way past the guards. That I would have died for nothing was irrelevant. I should have tried. Around this time, winter deepening into the season, when the Nile would flood in any normal year, word came that a relief army was approaching from Syria. Mithridates of Pergamum, a Roman ally, had gathered troops and was marching down the coast. Ptolemy's army marched east to confront him, meeting near the Nile's eastern branch. Caesar left a garrison to hold the Brucheian, and force marched his own troops to join the battle. For a few days, my cell was quieter than it had been in months. Then the sounds returned, but different now, triumphant. Caesar had won. His veteran legions and Mithridates' reinforcements had crushed the Ptolemaic forces in a single decisive engagement. Ptolemy himself had fled in a small boat, trying to reach his fleet, but the boat capsized. Weighted down by his golden armor, the boy pharaoh drowned in the Nile his ancestors had ruled for 3 centuries. Cleopatra was sole ruler now, backed by Roman swords, and the siege was over. The wars in Alexandria had ended, though the fires still smoldered. My imprisonment did not end with the siege. If anything, the guards seemed to forget about me in the chaos of victory. Days passed with no interrogations, no questions, just the daily bowl of gruel. I existed in a strange liminal state, neither condemned nor freed, a piece of bureaucratic detritus lost in the shuffle of Caesar's departure preparations. Because he was leaving, I learned from my wall companion. Caesar and Cleopatra were taking a pleasure cruise up the Nile, parading their alliance. Then he would return to Rome. The war would move on to other cities, leaving us to count our dead and rebuild. I wondered if anyone remembered I was down here. I wondered if I would simply die in this cell, my body discovered months later. It seemed possible, even likely. The thought should have terrified me, but I felt only a dull acceptance. Perhaps this was my punishment, not from Rome, but from the universe itself. I had failed in my duty as guardian of knowledge, and this was the price. Slow dissolution in darkness, forgotten and alone. But then one day, without warning, the door opened. Not the food slot, but the door itself, hinges creaking from disuse. Light flooded in, agonizing after so long in darkness, and I threw up my hands to shield my eyes. "Get up," a voice said, bored, routine. "You are released." I could not believe it, thought perhaps I was hallucinating. But rough hands hauled me to my feet, dragged me up the stairs I had descended months ago. My legs barely held me, muscles wasted, and I stumbled, fell, was jerked upright again. They brought me to a guardroom where a clerk sat with tablets and scrolls, looking irritated at the interruption. "Demetrios of Rhodes," he read from a list. "Charges dismissed for lack of evidence. You are released on condition you report to the military governor's office once weekly until further notice. Sign here." He thrust a wax tablet at me. I took the stylus with shaking hands, scratched my name, barely legible after months without writing. The clerk waved me away, already focused on his next task. The guards opened a door and shoved me through into blinding Mediterranean sunlight. I stood in a palace courtyard I recognized but could not quite place, disoriented, swaying. The world had too much light, too much color, too much space. Slowly my eyes adjusted. The courtyard was damaged, scorch marks on the marble, several columns cracked, evidence of the siege's violence. But it was recognizable still. Across the courtyard rose the Mouseion's familiar colonnades, and my heart seized with desperate hope. I stumbled toward it on legs that barely obeyed me, past busy soldiers who paid me no attention, through gardens where weeds had grown unchecked. The entrance stood open, unguarded. I climbed the steps, each one an effort, and entered the great hall where I had spent so many years in peaceful scholarship. It was intact. The scrolls still lined their cedar shelves, seemingly untouched, dust motes still floating in light from the high windows. Relief crashed over me so powerfully I nearly collapsed. The main library had survived. Whatever fires had burned in the harbor district, the core collection remained. But the hall was empty. No scholars bent over their reading, no slaves dusted shelves. Where were my colleagues? I walked through the silent corridors, my footsteps echoing, and found them finally in the refectory. a handful of familiar faces looking gaunt and weary. Theon saw me first, rose with a cry of joy, embraced me so hard I gasped. Others clustered around, asking questions, expressing relief at my survival. I asked my own questions through the babble. What had happened? Where was everyone else? Why was the library so empty? The answers came in fragments. The siege had devastated the scholarly community. Some had fled to the Serapeum or left the city entirely. Others had been killed in the fighting, caught in crossfires or murdered by mobs. Funding had ceased when Pothinus died, leaving the Mouseion to survive on dwindling reserves. They had kept the library intact through sheer stubborn determination, hiding scrolls when looters came close, guarding the collection with their lives. But the harbour warehouses? I asked, barely able to form the question. What of those scrolls? Silence fell, heavy and grieving. Theon spoke finally, his old voice steady but sad. Gone, he said simply. We do not know how many scrolls were stored there. Perhaps 40,000, perhaps more. Works awaiting shipment, duplicates being prepared for export, texts recently acquired from the East, all burned in Caesar's fire. 40,000. The number was incomprehensible, too large to truly grasp, yet too small to encompass the actual loss. How do you measure the death of knowledge? Not in raw numbers, but in what was unique, what was irreplaceable. Plays by Sophocles that no one would ever read again. Sappho's poems surviving only in fragments, scientific treatises, historical chronicles, philosophical dialogues, gone, erased, as though they had never been. It is not your fault, Theon said, reading my expression. You could not have saved them. The fire spread too fast, and we were trapped behind Roman lines. Even if we had reached the warehouses, we would have died in the flames. His kindness was worse than accusation. I wanted someone to blame me, to confirm what I already believed about my failure. I pulled away from his embrace and fled to the one place I knew, the archives where I had worked before my arrest. My corner desk was still there, dusty but undisturbed. The Aeschylus scroll I had been reading still laid out, though now brittle from months of neglect. I sat in my familiar chair and stared at words I had read 1,000 times, words that had survived 2,000 years to reach me, and I wept. Not quiet scholarly tears, but great racking sobs that shook my wasted frame, all the grief and guilt of the months in darkness pouring out. How long I sat there weeping, I do not know. Eventually the tears exhausted themselves, leaving me hollow but strangely clean. I looked at the Aeschylus scroll, at the familiar Greek letters marching across papyrus, and felt a flicker of something that was not quite hope, but was at least purpose. These scrolls remained. This knowledge survived. Perhaps it was enough. In the weeks that followed, I learned to navigate the new Alexandria. Caesar had left, sailing for Asia Minor to deal with Farnes's rebellion. Veni, Vidi, Vici, 3 words to summarize months of violence. Cleopatra ruled now as sole pharaoh, her brother-husband dead. Her sister Arsinoe paraded in chains through Rome before being exiled. She had won the civil war with Roman help and would spend the rest of her reign bound to Rome's interests. The city slowly repaired itself, rebuilding burned districts, clearing rubble, resuming trade. The great lighthouse still stood, a beacon that had guided Alexander's successors for 3 centuries and would guide Roman ships now. The harbour filled again with merchant vessels, life returning to something like normalcy, though the normal had changed. The Mouseion limped back to function, scholars trickling back as word spread that the library had survived. Funding resumed under Cleopatra's patronage, though less generous than before. We catalogued our losses, creating lists of what had burned. It was depressing work, an accounting of absence. We needed to know what we had lost so we could know what to seek. Some scrolls were lost forever, existing in only one copy that had been in those harbour warehouses. Those we marked as destroyed, final and irrecoverable. For others, we had duplicates or knew of copies in Pergamum, Athens or Rhodes. We sent letters requesting loans, beginning the slow work of rebuilding the collection. Decades it would take to restore what had been lost in those 3 days of fire. I threw myself into the work with obsessive dedication, arriving before dawn and leaving after dark. Work was refuge from thought, from the memories of my imprisonment. If I stayed busy enough, I could fall into exhausted sleep without the dreams of burning scrolls that haunted my nights. My colleagues urged me to rest, but I ignored them. Rest meant time to think, and thinking meant confronting questions I could not answer. The library became my world again, the only place where I felt I had purpose. But purpose could not completely erase doubt. Late at night, alone among the scrolls, I would wonder about the nature of what we did. We preserved knowledge, but to what end? So that soldiers like Caesar could ignore it? So that it could burn when military tactics required fire? The war had revealed the fragility of our enterprise. What good was knowledge if it could not prevent war, could not make men choose understanding over violence? I posed this question to Theon one evening. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "Knowledge does not prevent anything," he said finally. "It only allows understanding. Men will always choose violence. It is in our nature. But if we do not preserve what we learn, then each generation must start from the beginning, must remake all the same mistakes. We are not here to prevent Caesar. We are here so that in 100 years, when someone asks what happened in Alexandria, there will be answers. The answers may not matter to most people, but they will exist." It was small comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. We were not trying to save the world, only to give it the option of saving itself should it ever choose to try. That night, I slept without dreams of fire for the first time since my release. The months became years. I spent them in the Mouseion service, watching the library recover, seeing new scholars arrive. I grew older, my hair graying, my hands developing the tremor of a scribe. The city around me became more Roman in character, though it retained its Greek soul. I heard news from abroad. Caesar had returned to Rome in triumph, consolidated his power, and then, in the Ides of March, was assassinated by senators who thought they were saving the Republic. The Republic died anyway, consumed in new civil wars. Egypt became a pawn again, Cleopatra allying with Antony, the two of them defeated finally at Actium by Octavian. She died by her own hand, a serpent's bite, choosing death over humiliation. Egypt became a Roman province, the last of Alexander's successor kingdoms absorbed into the new order. Through it all the library endured. Emperors came and went, wars flared and faded, but the scrolls remained. We added to the collection, acquiring new works, creating new catalogues. The fire became history, a cautionary tale told to new arrivals. This is why we keep duplicates, why we copy important works. We learned from our loss how fragile knowledge is. I am an old man now, writing these words in the fading light of an autumn afternoon, the same season when Caesar first arrived so many years ago. My hands shake, but I can still read, still remember. The cell where I was imprisoned is part of the palace complex that no longer exists, torn down and rebuilt by Roman administrators. But I remember every stone of it, every moment of darkness, the crushing weight of failure. I have spent the decades since trying to atone, trying to justify my survival when so much knowledge died. I do not know if I have succeeded. Perhaps survival needs no justification beyond the simple fact of continuing. I saved nothing from the fire that day, but I have helped preserve much since, have trained other librarians, have copied scrolls that might otherwise have been lost to time. It is not enough, will never be enough, but it is something. The library will outlive me. I am certain of that. It survived Caesar, survived the fires, survived the transition from Ptolemaic to Roman rule. It will survive other catastrophes. Knowledge is resilient in ways that individuals are not, distributed across many minds, harder to extinguish than any single flame. But it is also fragile, dependent on people choosing to preserve it, to value it. We must choose, each generation, to be guardians rather than destroyers. Most will choose otherwise, I know that now. Most will choose power or wealth, but some will choose knowledge, will choose preservation. That is my hope, thin as it is, that there will always be some who choose the scrolls over the sword, understanding over victory. I will not live to see whether that hope is justified. My time is nearly done. Soon I will join Theon and the others in whatever afterlife awaits scholars and failures. But before I go, I will train one more librarian, copy one more scroll. I will do the work, because the work is all I have. Because in the end, we are remembered not by our failures, but by what we built despite them. The scrolls I failed to save are gone, erased from history. But the Mouseion stands, the library endures, and perhaps, in some future age, when the wars and Caesars of our time are ancient history themselves, someone will read these words I have scratched into papyrus and know that we tried, that we failed, that we tried again anyway. That is not heroism, just the stubborn persistence of people who believe that knowledge matters. I was Demetrios of Rhodes, librarian of Alexandria, prisoner and survivor. I watched the greatest repository of human knowledge burn, and I did nothing to stop it. That is my failure, my shame. But I also watched it rise from the ashes, scroll by scroll, the patient work of preservation outlasting the brief violence of destruction. That is my legacy. The fire burned for 3 days. The library has endured for centuries and will endure for centuries more, long after my name is forgotten. That is cold comfort to a man who failed when it mattered most. But it is the only comfort I have. The scrolls remain. The work continues. The light of knowledge flickers but does not go out, tended by scholars whose names no one will remember, preserved by people who chose preservation over glory. We are not heroes. We are merely keepers of the flame, and we do our work in darkness, hoping that somewhere, sometime, someone will have light enough to read by what we have kept for them. That is all. That is everything. That is the story of the day the library burned, told by a man who was there and failed and lived with the failure every day since. I do not ask for forgiveness, only that you remember the scrolls that were lost, the price that is paid when violence comes to places of learning. Remember and choose differently. Guard what is precious with more courage than I showed. That is my last wish, scratched into papyrus in the fading light. The library endures. May it endure forever, or for as long as humans value knowledge over power. I am Demetrios of Rhodes, and I have told you true. The fire burns low, the voice falls silent. Rest now, the history remains.